Bibliophiles of the internet, today I thought it'd be fun to share some queer stories about baking and or bakeries. I was recently talking to a friend about this very niche subgenre of queer books, and I thought it'd be cute to put together a little resource that can be a jumping off point for folks who want to read even more of these stories. Baking, and by extension cooking, holds a very special place in my heart personally, not only because it's something that my family has always done together, but also because I see food as a symbol of nourishment, sustenance, community, love, and connectedness, and I think that's a big part of why I love to see it in books. I also just really appreciate baking as a really interesting intersection between caretaking and creativity in so many ways. I've watched pretty much every single baking show there is to watch, so I'm just very invested in the process for some reason. So with that said, as always, this is not intended to be a definitive nor exhaustive list. For those of you wondering why I always say that, it's because there's always someone in my comment section insisting that I forgot a book. I assure you, I did not. I am simply not setting out to name every single book in existence that would address this topic, and you may know different ones, and that's okay. Additionally, if I've read any of these books and I would personally recommend them, I will let you know as we go along, so let's get into it. The first book I want to mention is one that's been very high up on my TBR for so long, and that is The Heartbreak Bakery by A.R. Capetta. This is a queer YA contemporary story with a hint of magic about a main character named Sid, who I believe is agender and does not use pronouns, and who also literally channels all emotions and experiences into baking, which ends up affecting everyone who eats what Sid bakes. When Sid starts working at a local queer bakery after a messy breakup, there's a mysterious phenomenon where everyone who eats Sid's breakup brownies ends up breaking up themselves. This happens to include the owners of the bakery, which could spell trouble for everyone who works there, including Sid. But when Sid and the new bike delivery person team up, the two of them decide to figure out a recipe that can fix this mess. I've heard such great reviews from literally everyone who's read this, and I think it has such a fantastic concept as well, with emotions being infused into baked goods and just causing chaos. There seems to be a budding romance, an examination of community, and really fun magic. What else could you possibly want? Next we have Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. It's a contemporary adult romance between a queer female character and a pansexual non-binary character as written by a non-binary author. Both characters are amateur chefs who have been cast in one of the biggest cooking competitions on TV, and it could very well change both of their lives. London announces their pronouns on the very first episode of the show and accidentally sets themselves up as the first openly non-binary contestant in the show's history, which is both exciting and terrifying, and they are determined to finally prove themselves and take home the win. Dahlia, on the other hand, is using the show as a chance to reinvent herself, especially after dealing with some financial and emotional hardship after a recent divorce. The prize money could definitely get her back on track, but London would also love to use the prize money to start their own queer nonprofit. While neither of them had love on the menu, they'll have to see whether their off-camera antics can make them take their eyes off the prize. I have read this one and quite enjoyed it. It's a little bit cheating because it's technically a cooking show, so not every round is a baking round, but baking and desserts are absolutely involved, I promise. I think it's nice to see two characters who are equally passionate about what they do, but in such different ways. And I think this story is able to strike a great balance between cooking content, spicy content, and relationship growth. Next, I want to talk about Rosaline Palmer Takes the Cake by Alexis Hall. After being destroyed by a Lady Duke, I am on a mission to eventually read as many of Alexis Hall's books as I possibly can, and this one is super high on my list because it's about baking queers, or at least it's about one baking queer because I believe the main character is a bisexual single parent. The story is about the titular Rosaline Palmer, who, as I said, is a single parent who dropped out of college to raise her child. Now she's all but teetering on the absolute brink of financial disaster, but everything could change when she learns that she's landed a spot on the nation's most beloved baking show. Once she's there, she's determined to keep her head down and make it all the way to the end and get that prize money so she can finally give her daughter the life she deserves. But against her better judgment, she finds herself being charmed by a shy electrician named Harry Dobson, who is making her question everything she believes. I wanted to include this book especially because we need to stop erasing the experience of bisexuality in quote-unquote straight-passing relationships, because having one or more queer person in a relationship makes it a queer relationship by definition. So that's one reason, but I've also heard really great things about the baking content in this story specifically. It's definitely a major part of the plot. So if you, like me, enjoy baking content in whatever media you can get your hands on, then you would most likely enjoy this, and I'm sure it's also a story with a lot of laughs as well. Speaking of Alexis Hall, he has a companion book, I believe, coming out later this year, which is called Paris Dalincourt is About to Crumble, and I think it's supposed to release on October 18th. This is another contemporary queer adult romance about Paris Dalincourt, who's an absolute disaster, constantly constantly battling with anxiety and self-doubt, which more often than not makes him a complete mess. When his roommate secretly enters him in Bake Expectations, which I'm pretty sure is the baking show from the first book, Paris really and truly believes that he is going to be eliminated first. But not only does he pass the first challenge with flying colors, but he meets the very cute Tariq Hassan, who's not only incredibly kind, but also super confident. When the show's incredibly active fan base begins tapping into Paris's worst fears, the question becomes whether he's going to let his anxiety ruin this budding romance and also his potential happiness. I have just told you literally everything I know about this book as of right now, and I want it in my hands immediately. It's one thing to read about people falling in love as they bake together, but it's another thing entirely when you get to see them really coming into their own at the same time, and I think the story is definitely going to give us exactly that and so much more. On a very different note, next on my list is The Mirror Season by A.M. Macklemore. This is one of their more recent releases. It's a queer YA magical realism story about a pansexual Mexican-American girl named Graciela who meets Locke and realizes shortly afterwards that unfortunately they were both sexually assaulted at the same party. Because of that same trauma, Graciela realizes that she's losing her ability to make magical pan dulce, and at the same time she realizes that the neighborhood's trees are disappearing overnight, and that the town is slowly being covered in glass. As I said, this story deals with some more sensitive topics, namely sexual assault, trauma, PTSD, and bullying, so definitely look up the content warnings before going into it. I wanted to include this book because while it does have a romantic piece, I think it goes to show that not all books about baking queers are light and fluffy romances. But also, even though this story does explore trauma with a very deft hand, if I may say so, it also leaves plenty of room for tenderness, joy, and softness. Ciela's connection with baking is very unique as well because of course she and her family bake the pan dulce since her family owns the panderia, but her magic is more about being able to read people and instantly know what kind of pan dulce they want. The type of pan dulce is connected to what is dwelling secretly in their hearts, what they need the most but can't vocalize, and it's also indicative of their deepest desires. And because that magic comes from her family, her history, her culture, that's what makes it so special, and I think that element is not only incredibly fascinating and super well done, but also prominent enough to warrant a spot on this list. Next we have a middle grade book called All You Need Is Love by Tania Guerrero. This is a queer middle grade book that follows 12-year-old Alba, who is Filipino and Spanish, and she's being sent to live with her abuela in Barcelona for the summer as her mother attempts to finally leave her abusive marriage. So again, definitely look up content warnings for that, but the story is more so about Alba reconnecting with her grandmother in Spain, finding a sense of home and routine in her grandmother's bakery, meeting a supportive father figure, and making new friends. And not only does she discover a newfound talent for baking bread and some new questions about gender as well, but she believes that she knows a way to both save her abuela's bakery and also make her family better than it ever was. Again, this story does touch on some sensitive topics, but everyone I know who's read it has really enjoyed it and mentioned that while it's definitely heart-wrenching at times, it's also incredibly warm and heartfelt. I also wanted to include this book to once again show that not all books about baking queers are romances. A book is queer when it has a queer POV character or multiple queer POV characters, and that's literally the entire definition. So if you love stories about healing, baking bread, and saving bakeries from being closed, I think you would definitely enjoy this. Next, I want to mention a couple of graphic novels, and I'm going to start with Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganusho. This is an incredibly sweet MLM graphic novel about Ari, who wants nothing more than to move out of town and start getting serious about his music with his band. But first he has to convince his parents to let him quit the family business. His family owns a bakery and they depend on him to help out, so to show them that he's serious, he begins interviewing candidates to replace him, which is how he meets Hector, an easygoing guy who loves to bake. Ari sticks around to help train Hector, and as the two of them get closer and closer over batches of bread, it becomes clear that something new is definitely blooming between them. This is perhaps the softest queer comic I've ever read in my life. And yes, I did very carefully consider other queer comics before saying that, and I stand by my assessment. Because we're talking about baking, I want to start there and say that baking is such a sensory activity and the visual element is almost as important as how something tastes. And because this is a comic, you really get to experience the entirety of that process. There are these truly stunning spreads where you're just swept away in the sensory experience of baking something, and that visual element really allows you to feel Hector's passion just emanating off the page. This is one of my absolute favorite titles on this entire list, and if you only read one thing from this video, it should definitely be this. Then purely for posterity, I have to mention Check Please by Ngozi Ukazu. While not necessarily a baking story in nature, this is a queer sports graphic novel about Biddy, who is a former ice skating champion, amateur baker, and vlogger, and incoming freshman at Samuel University who's about to trade his ice skates for hockey skates. As he tries to get over his intense fear of being checked Biddy also finds himself falling for the moody and surly team captain named Jack. Listen, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Check Please. It is as good as everyone says it is, and absolutely worth every single ounce of hype, I promise. Even though the story is not primarily about baking, the main character Biddy is definitely known as the resident baker of the hockey team, and that's one of his biggest character traits. No matter what is happening in the story, he is always baking something in the background and making things to share with his teammates. It's super sweet and cute, and I simply could not exclude Biddy if I'm making a video about baking queers. Next, I wanted to bring up Baker Thief by Claudie Arsenault. This is the first book in a queer fantasy series that centers non-romantic relationships and a main character who is bigender and aromantic. The story follows Adele, who's desperately been trying to catch the purple-haired thief who stole her exocore, and in this world, exocores are basically heralded as the energy source of the future. Our thief is actually the local baker, Claire, who runs her bakery during the day and steals exocores at night because she knows that they're actually unethically made from witches' souls. When Claire's twin sister, who happens to be a very powerful witch herself, goes missing, Claire doubles down on her thievery and investigation, but she keeps running into Adele every which way she turns. Not only did I want to show some love to a self-published book, but this just sounds delightful. I love stories that blend a bit of fantasy with the contemporary world in really interesting ways, and I kind of love that our main character is both a baker and a vigilante thief. Admittedly, I don't know how much the baking aspect is involved, but with the main character owning a bakery, I feel pretty good about having this one on this list. Next, I would also like to mention Graham's Delicacies by Mina Waheed. I believe this one is also self-published. It's a series of 3 interconnected novellas or short stories, and the tagline is literally 6 people and 3 love stories, all in one bakery. There's a story about a character who loves watching their friend bake in the kitchen and is slowly falling in love with them, another one about 2 co-workers, I assume in the bakery, trying to get over their insecurities with one another, and the last one is about trying to save the bakery while also romancing the one who got away. I've had this ebook for ages. I just love the idea of these 3 different stories all taking place in the same bakery, and while the stakes are not especially high in any of these scenarios, there's also something comforting about that simplicity and just having these romantic stories that are genuinely sweet. Lastly for today, I'll be talking about the remaking of Corbin Whale by Rome Parrish. This is a queer adult romance with a touch of magic that might be set around Hanukkah, and it follows Alex, a Jewish baker whose life completely fell to pieces before the story begins, but now he's moved back to his hometown in Michigan and he's finally opening the bakery of his dreams. However, the excitement of opening day is nothing compared to the mysterious, lonely, beautiful man who bewitches Alex before he even orders. Corbin Whale is definitely considered the odd person out in town, and he often feels like he's living in his own world as he tries not to associate with too many people, but when he starts working at the bakery, he realizes that he may not be able to keep Alex at a distance. Another one I've had as an ebook for literal years. Everyone who's read this book says it's super warm, endearing, and delightful with some surprising, spicy elements after a slow burn romance, so if that's your jam, you should definitely get into this. The idea of 2 lonely gays slowly falling for each other as they work side by side in the same bakery almost sounds too good to be true, and I cannot wait to finally get to this. So those are most of the queer books I know about that involve baking to some extent. I hope you were able to add some new titles to your list, and if you know of any others that fit the bill, please do share them down below in the comments. But that is everything I had to share with you for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.